All right, let's just get this thing started. Happy Friday to you. Hopefully you are having a wonderful Friday. And so let's just dig right in and take a look at the First World War. Past several days, you've been looking at the First World War and the totality of it. And so I just want to take a moment to kind of put some loose ends to that in the first half of our Google Meet, and then the second half kind of look at begin to look at maybe the impact of it. So you can kind of see our agenda there. I've got a little video clip here, and you know, I always like little video clips, and I feel perhaps maybe as a social studies teacher that's almost like an obligatory thing to do. Then debrief the total war and look at some of the effects of it, and then just talk briefly about maybe some future assessments, summative assessments, and then kind of cut you loose for the weekend. Does anyone have anything good for the cause before we start? All right, so I have a video clip here that I will start, and it's going to be highlighting the legacy of the First World War, and we're going to use that kind of as a launch pad here to our discussion.
Summarizing the legacy of World War I in a word is difficult, but the word I use would be paradox. Because here was a tremendous opportunity for the world to learn about some of the dangerous mistakes that helped to lead to that war. And yet what we saw over the course of the 20th century in many ways was the replication of those same errors again and again and again.
What World War I gave us was this legacy of inquiry of how to make war more effective, better, but ultimately, and with horrible consequences, much bloodier.
It changed the world forever because of the Second World War and the fact that Germany was left unchecked. Germany was able to build up its armaments even though it was told as a country, you need to cut back on your Navy, you need to cut back on your Army, your aircraft, and so forth. And so really the legacy is that it led to a second and more costlier war.
I think the legacy of the First World War for America is not only about our place in the world, but also about how America itself is transformed, and in particular, the relationship between Americans and the federal government. Coming out of the First World War, the federal government is much larger, more powerful, and everyday Americans who had experienced the draft, who had experienced food conservation, who had experienced the mobilization of their labor during the war, understood that Uncle Sam had significant powers.
The world had a tremendous opportunity in 1918 to ferret out those things that were dividing people. Our failure to deal with those issues, to have self-determination or allow people to talk about that, certainly will be a contributing factor in Vietnam, certainly will be a contributing factor as we talk about the world today and we look at the Middle East. A lot of those problems, a lot of those issues politically that we failed to address in substantive ways in World War I continue to haunt us to this day.
Okay, and so just a little brief clip there, you know, and I like those little brief clips, and it did have some what I like to always say, some good historical nuggets in that little video clip. And yeah, it may have been brought in more of a U.S. perspective to it, but it did have some really good takeaways. Does anyone have any thoughts quickly on the legacies that was briefly mentioned in that little clip?
I don't know if it's particularly about legacy per se,
Okay.
but I've been thinking about that like one word to describe World War One a little while back.
Mm-hmm.
And people, these different historians were saying, oh, it was stupid, it was avoidable. But I'm not so sure that that type of conflict was avoidable.
Okay. No, I think, Lane, you're bringing up a good point in terms of, was it avoidable or not? And I think, you're looking at different factors that could contribute to what we think is contributing to this outbreak. I mean, this conflict could have happened at just about any moment at any time as well. So I think, as historians, and I like us to look at ourselves as historians, and we like to use hindsight in our when we make interpretations or when we are arriving at conclusions. And so we're using hindsight and we think, okay, yeah, it could be avoidable. If this would have happened, if that would have happened. And so some historians do arrive at that. But no, I think you bring up some good points about just that particular interpretation or that particular view.
Because
so,
like
go ahead.
with World War One, without changing the nationalism
Mhm.
and the webs of alliances and imperialist attitudes, it really had to happen. If not with the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which was basically on accident, it would have been something else.
Right.
As who was it? Otto von Bismarck? Some damn foolish thing in the Balkans.
Yeah. Good point there. I think when we talk about the legacy, people want to look at the First World War as really an extension of the Second World War, or the beginning of a Second World War. And we're going to have like 20 years in between the end of the First World War and the beginning of the Second World War. So you have this, what we'll call this little interregnum of peace going on there. Just beyond that fact, if we look at what this war spurs and creates, this idea that future conflicts are going to be more deadlier because of the inquiry and the creation of all these new technology pieces. But then countries like the United States begin to kind of reevaluate their position in the world. Now, after the First World War, the United States goes back to its isolationism, and a lot of it has to do with who replaces Woodrow Wilson as president of the United States. But we also looked at how government changed, and in your total war activity, that kind of was brought up in there as well. The one historian that talked about how the First World War legacy is a paradox, and you could almost look at future conflicts and tie it back to the First World War. I mean, the one historian he threw in there that about Vietnam and this idea of self-determination. it wasn't the 1950s or 60s the first time we heard of Ho Chi Minh. I mean, we heard of Ho Chi Minh at the end of during the Second World War, but Ho Chi Minh also made an appearance at the Versailles Conference, and making a quest for self-determination, even all the way back then. And so, or today in the Middle East, you hear of a group known as the Kurds. Well, at the end of the First World War, there was this.
Sykes-Picot.
What's that?
Sykes-Picot.
So you've got this idea of a Kurdistan being created here, or with Israel, with this idea that with the Balfour Declaration there was going to be a creation of an Israel. It never happened. So you can look at a number of contemporary events and issues and tie it all the way back. And so here was a war to end all wars, make the world safe for democracy, and we've got a lot of unfinished business with it. All right. Here we're gonna play around with this here for a moment. I'm gonna open up a Jamboard related to the total war. All right. And in the chat, a link should pop up, and hopefully everyone can get access to it. Let me share my screen. All right, so hopefully we can see this here. And what I would like you to do is just put a little post it out there, or just put a little thought. Let's be appropriate as we do this. Good digital citizenship here. Just put an example or a couple examples that you came across in your total war activity that demonstrates why we would think the First World War is a total war. And remember, we're looking at, when we considered a total war, this idea of creating a large fighting force, the use of civilians in the war, using all that you have in your arsenal, the government control, of course, and then the targeting of civilians. All right, seeing some stuff there. People are trying to write. I like that. And it's okay, if we get some duplication there, that's fine. I see a lot of good ideas being put out there. So when I look at the IB history exam, and looking at some of the prompts that they have used over the years, when they look at the First World War, they like to look at things that caused it. But then they want to look at also how the war plays out, the course or the nature of it. And sometimes they make statements that, to what extent was World War I really a world war? And so looking out there, I see that it wasn't just in Europe, that it was in multiple areas, and you can make a good claim for that as well. When it came time to making peace, though, you could say that it's rather a European affair that made the peace, and the other nations that participated in it, well, basically are just going to sit back and let the big four make the determination there. Looking at some new technologies that are being used here to help with demonstrating why World War I is a total war, that it's true. I guess one of the questions is, did the technology really influence the outcome of this war, or were there other factors that influenced the outcome of the war? You know, they did create some of these new technologies, these big guns, of course, the use of gas in there. Tanks are being used. And so you see a lot of technology, but did it really contribute to the outcome of the war? You know, help create a stalemate. So those are things that you got to think about with that as well. A lot of really good stuff in here, resources, use all the resources available. I mean, absolutely. On the home front, that little video clip did talk about us having to ration food. Here in the United States, though, it was voluntary. It wasn't mandatory by any means. And the person that was really in charge of that on a national level was Herbert Hoover. But other countries, it was more mandatory for the rationing of food. But in that little clip there, it talked about how the government really got really involved in people's lives, you know, like the conscription, but also the war effort in terms of the industries, but then also asking people to open up their wallet and pay for the war through Liberty bonds. And you find that in all the countries. So realistically, you can make a claim here that World War I definitely is a total war. All right. Anyone have any thoughts about World War I as a total war?
I think it was important because that was sort of the reason that after the war, Germany was just like completely destroyed, is because they put all their resources and all their money into it.
That's a really good point. And so that goes back to when I had thought about or talked about I don't know why I'm clicking here. I'm a clicking machine. The things that led to the end of this war, we always place an emphasis a lot on technology, but the technology, everything that they thought was going to break the stalemate, would only maybe contribute to extending that stalemate. Germany, by the time the war is coming to an end, is running out of money to run this war. They spent so much money on creating a magnificent navy that they could use the submarines, but had one big epic sea battle of Jutland. And for the most part, this magnificent navy stayed in harbor because it was too expensive to operate. And then you have riots in the streets in Germany, food riots, and you have the potential for mutinies to occur. And then the government collapses and the Kaiser abdicates and goes to the Netherlands. And so Germany, they threw all in. They took a big gamble, and it didn't work out for them in the end. Again, when we talk about legacy of World War I, their treatment at the peace table becomes center in their quest to rebuild and to perhaps get revenge and find their place back at the table. Okay. Anyone else have a thought? All right, so make sure if you have not turned in that total war activity, please do that. That is a summative, so it is important that you do that. To wrap up World War I, and each week we are going to be focusing on a conflict. Last week it was Spanish Civil War. This week it's the First World War. Next week it's going to be the Second World War. So we want to wrap it up. Got some focus questions. The effects of the First World War. It's your typical focus questions. What I want you to emphasize and look at here is the economic and the political consequences of the First World War. But we have these empires that had dominated the European scene for decades, if not centuries. They're gone, and they're going to be replaced. We're going to have some political consequences and some redrawing of the borders in Europe, and in the emergence of some new democracies there. But then also people who may not have been involved in the political process are going to be brought in here. Economics, there's an economic cost here. Now, we know that United States, in some ways, Uncle Sam was the world's ATM machine, in that we're going to help finance quite a few nations' endeavors here. And so the economic consequences are going to play out in the 1920s and 30s here. And for the United States, for us, we find ourselves in a new situation, a new position. There's going to be some impacts with that. Problems for the peacemakers, in many ways are going to be same with the problems going into fighting this conflict. You've got all these different groups out there, all these different nations out there, and coming to the peace table, you're supposed to address the causes of war, but they might have some other interests as well. And so when you look at the criticisms of the Treaty of Versailles, which is coming out of the Paris Conference, and there's going to be some criticisms there. And whether it's who gets the blame and who doesn't get their interests recognized, how far-reaching is the treaty going to be, how quickly the treaty is put together. It seems like, the war in some ways is initiated with an assassination of an archduke in June. Well, by June of 1919, they have a peace treaty, and one would say it's kind of hastily put together. So almost 5 years to the day that the assassination occurred, they're putting this treaty together here. And then ultimately the impact of the war and the peace treaty by the early 1920s. You want to focus on a number of issues here. And so take some time with that. And then, of course, the summary question. All right, so that is going to be your task for the weekend, to get the focus questions done. Sometimes when we look at the IB history exam, they do want to focus on the peacemaking process. And so that's why you see in the focus questions, there's an emphasis on that peacemaking process. Okay, so that is your homework. Future assessments, we can almost guarantee that next week we'll have a summative assessment similar to what you just did with the total war with First World War. We're going to probably have that, something similar with that, with the Second World War, and then before we go on winter break, we'll have an assessment that's going to focus on all the conflicts that we looked at, the Chinese, the Spanish, the First and the Second World War. So when I said, get your historical seatbelt on and be ready for the ride, well, we're going to have a ride. We're going to have that historical ride. Okay. So does anyone have any questions? All right. Well, I appreciate all that all those who have put some thoughts in on that Jamboard, and questions that were brought up during the day. So I appreciate that. And so as we go into the weekend, you want to make sure that you are working on those focus questions. And I hope that you have a great day and a wonderful weekend, and I will see you on Monday.